Today I'm really delighted to welcome our speaker, Jaeeun Kim, Assistant Professor of Sociology. We'll be talking to you today about her recent book, Contested Embrace, Transborder Membership Politics in 20th-Century Korea. And this is, of course, an award-winning book, and it is, well, it looks at an issue that is very close to a lot of my own research about diasporic communities, and also how the population is really changing in Korea, and how different the face of Korea is changing in not only ethnic terms, but just how different nationalities are, actually diasporic communities from outside of Korea, are fitting into Korea itself. Jaeeun Kim she just finished a one-year fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University, and so we're glad to have her back. And she was formerly there at the Center for the Study of Religion in 2011, followed by a fellowship at Stanford University. She did her PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles. And please help me in welcoming Professor Jaeeun Kim.
Well, thanks, David, for introduction, and thanks everybody for coming. So my book came out in the summer of 2016, and after that I've given some book talks in other schools here and abroad, and it kind of feels like this is a homecoming, like giving a book talk at the University of Michigan. You know, if I borrow the sort of traditional Confucian metaphor, you know, this is like 친정, my natal home. So I just basically left my home, just, you know, by getting married to some guy and maybe living for quite some time, subject to the sort of scrutiny of my husband's family, and then I came back home. But then I kind of realized in my real life, my mom is the sort of the biggest critic of my inadequacy with the sharpest tongue. So maybe I shouldn't get too cozy and relaxed in this setting, because this is homecoming. I'd like to start my talk with the two stories that open my book. So the first is the story of a person I call Jin-tae. So when I visited Jin-tae's house in Osaka in 2009, two framed photos hung on the living room wall. One was a group photo taken with the late North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, during Jin-tae's visit to, grandfather, during Jin-tae's visit to North Korea in 1988. The other was a photo of Jin-tae and his wife taken in their hometown in South Korea in 2006. In the photo, they faced the camera dressed in splendid traditional Korean wedding garments. And the colorful garments gleamed in stark contrast to the gray hair, wrinkled faces, and stooped backs of the two beaming octogenarians. Jin-tae was born in 1923 in Jeju, an island at the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, like at the map. And he followed his father to Osaka at the age of 14 and worked in various manufacturing jobs until the end of the Pacific War in 1945. His family members joined a massive repatriation flow back to the Korean peninsula, but Jin-tae postponed his return. At the time, he had no inkling that it would be almost 70 years before he could return to his hometown. Jin-tae became a supporter of a pro-North Korea organization in Japan, and the South Korean government banned his return. When the South Korean consular office finally issued temporary travel permits to Jin-tae and his wife in 2006, they held a long, overdue wedding ceremony commemorated by the photo in the living room that I introduced. After returning to Japan, the couple finally changed their nationality category in their foreigners registry documents to Kangkoku, meaning South Korea, and subsequently applied for South Korean passports. These enable them to complete the belated registration of their marriage and their children's births and grandchildren's births too in the South Korean family registries. He told me, having South Korean passports and family registration documents will make it much easier for my children to travel overseas and handle family property left in South Korea. So let me just move on to the second story. Youngin was born in Heilongjiang province in northeast China in 1947. His father left his poverty-stricken hometown at the southwestern end of the Korean peninsula in 1938 to find work in then Japan-occupied Manchuria. Back then, he had no idea that the collapse of the Japanese Empire, the occupation of Manchuria by the Soviet Army, and the ensuing civil wars in China and Korea would effectively prohibit his return before his death. Youngil, the second son, managed to join the army and the Communist Party in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, which helped his career as a rural cadre. But when he first visited South Korea in 1989 in his early 40s, Youngil found that peddling Chinese medicine or working at construction sites in South Korea could bring him at least 10 times the income he was earning in China. He managed to persuade his South Korean relatives to list him in the family genealogy book called Chukbu and write several letters of invitation. And this helped Youngil and his wife obtain entry visas to South Korea. But the restrictive immigration policies in the early 1990s in South Korea made it virtually impossible for co-ethnic migrants from China like Youngil to enter South Korea via legal channels. It was only through the invitation of his divorced daughter, who had remarried a South Korean man, although only on paper, that Youngil and his wife were able to return to South Korea in 1997. The couple overstayed the designated visa term and worked in South Korea without legal status for 9 years until policy change finally enabled them to obtain South Korean citizenship in 2006. Youngil's son also obtained the South Korean citizenship, but unlike his parents, he was not interested in settling permanently in South Korea. In fact, by the time I interviewed him, his son was working at a Korean restaurant in Japan without papers. Youngil told me, without the South Korean passport, my son couldn't possibly have been exempted from the visa screening process at the Japanese consular office. So the stories of Jin-tae and Youngil just reveal some of the common experiences of colonial era ethnic Korean migrants to Japan and Northeast China. These experiences include a series of border crossings spanning multiple generations, forcible separation from or persecution by their state of origin, and a shifting sense of loyalty and belonging to the multiple states involved. Each story also describes painstaking efforts to maintain, rebuild, appropriate, or create cross-border family ties. Other common features are the complex dealings with various official and unofficial documentation practices as they attempt to reclaim membership in their putative homeland. So my book, Contested Embrace, is a comparative historical and ethnographic study of these complex relationships between the states in the Korean peninsula, colonial-era ethnic Korean migrants to Japan and Northeast China and their descendants, and the states in which they have resided during the colonial, Cold War, and post-Cold War periods. Korea is often considered an ethnically homogeneous nation and the paradigmatic case of powerful ethnic nationalism. So Koreans tend to define their nation in ethnic terms. Nonetheless, the embrace of these transborder ethnic Koreans by the colonial and the two post-colonial states, North and South Korea, has been selective, shifting, and recurrently contested. My book explores under what circumstances and by what means the colonial and post-colonial states have sought to claim, failed to claim, or sometimes refused to claim certain transborder populations as their own. Equally importantly, it also examines how transborder Koreans have themselves shaped the making, unmaking, and remaking of these transborder ties as they have sought long-distance membership on their own terms. So let me just first situate the book in the broader fields of international migration, nationalism, and citizenship. Scholars in these fields have long examined the challenges, the various types of internal others, such as immigrants or ethnic minorities, pose to the regulatory idea of the modern nation state. That is the idea that the boundary of the territory, the boundary of the citizenry, the boundary of the nation must coincide with each other. But over the last decade or so, scholars have begun to show growing interest in the membership politics engendered by the shifting relationship between the state and what might call by its external members, such as immigrants, diasporas, and ethno-national kin populations. I construe this diverse range of phenomena as a transborder membership politics, which I would simply call TMP for this talk. So TMP involves political claims, institutionalized practices, and discursive representations oriented to or generated by those who have durably resided outside the territory of the state, yet nonetheless are perceived for some reasons as belonging to the state or to the nation associated with that state. Here I use transborder instead of the more conventional term transnational. It is because the claim that people located outside the territorial jurisdiction of the state still belong to the same nation. So they are kind of like outside the state, but inside the people. This idea is central to and even constitutive of this politics. So they are transborder, but not necessarily transnational. Scholars have approached the TMP from various angles. They have examined the impact of immigrant remittances on the economic development of sending countries, long-distance political participation, and the democratization or the civil war in their home country, transnational circulation of culture, and complex configurations of diasporic identities, so forth and so on. But today, I want to bring your attention to the hidden venue and modality of TMP, namely the micro-political struggles in bureaucratic settings. So my theoretical interest in the role of bureaucratic practices in TMP is derived from my two-pronged approach to the politics of ethno-racial boundary making. The existing scholarship on TMP has largely focused on the question of who gets what. In other words, scholars have focused on disputes over what economic, political, social rights and obligations and influences transborder members, these external members, should have vis-a-vis their putative homeland states. Examples would include, for instance, the debate over whether Mexican Americans should be able to have voting rights in Mexican elections while living abroad, right? Or whether second or third generation Japanese Brazilians should be given some special visa status in Japan to make it easier for them to visit or work or live in Japan than other non-Japanese foreigners or something like that. In contrast, the question of who is what, the politics of identity, has remained understudied from a theoretical and comparative perspective. My book focuses on this question of identity and the shifting boundary of the transborder nation. And in particular, I highlight the two dimensions of the politics of identity. So on the one hand, one may debate on how to define the boundary of the transborder nation. That is the question of which criteria of ethno-national membership should be selected. For example, one can focus on ancestry, focus on culture, religion, birthplace, territorial origin, phenotype, social association, like who you hang out with, who you marry, or self-identification. But there's another dimension to the politics of who is what. The politics of identity also involved disputes concerning how to establish if a particular individual belongs to the transborder nation, however its boundary is drawn in the first place. Let me just explain a bit more. So, for example, let's say a consensus has been reached regarding the importance of ancestry as a criteria of ethnic membership. So you look at ancestry, who you are born to define like what kind of ethnicity, ethnic group you belong to, right? Still, one must decide which indicia to rely on establish ancestry. Whether to rely on official registration documents like your birth certificates, right? Affidavits from alleged kin members, or DNA test results can become the center of heated disputes with far-reaching consequences. The second kind of disputes often unfold in various bureaucratic settings, such as municipalities, college admission offices, census bureaus, and immigration offices. And these contestations in mundane bureaucratic settings are largely hidden from the public view, and they also have been largely neglected in the scholarship on ethno-racial boundary making in general and the literature on TMP in particular. What I'd like to demonstrate is why this is a critical omission. So my book develops a set of general sociological arguments about how micropolitical struggles in bureaucratic settings shape profoundly the contour of TMP. But given the nature of today's venue at the Nam Center for Korean Studies and Asian Studies International Institute, I'd like to just move right into the empirical case to flesh out these arguments with the concrete examples rather than spending too much time on some abstract theoretical exercise. I see some sociology folks here, so of course I would be happy to sort of engage more theoretical discussion during the Q&A session. So Japan's occupation of Korea at the turn of the 20th century set in motion a massive outmigration of the colonial population to other parts of the empire. Post-war repatriation left about 0.6 million in Japan and 1.2 million in now communist China. Transborder membership politics in 20th century Korea focused on these two populations. So the handout that you have in front of you, I hope everybody has it, includes the table of contents of my book and the abstract of each chapter. And today I'll just discuss parts of chapter 2 and 4. So first, I will discuss South Korea's effort to create its own docile citizens out of ethnic Koreans in Japan in a fierce competition with North Korea, as alluded by Jin-tae's story. With this analysis, I'd like to show how bureaucratic procedures, especially various registration and documentation practices, constitute the conceptual grid through which a state identifies its transborder population. To borrow anthropologist James Scott's much celebrated term, these bureaucratic practices rendered transborder populations legible to the homeland state by providing an instrument with which to distinguish docile Koreans from the subversive and mobilize the former for its own agendas. Second, I will examine South Korea's effort to control its membership boundary from ethnic Korean, quote-unquote, return migrants from China, alluded by Youngil's story. With this analysis, I'd like to highlight how the homeland state turns to the durable documentary traces left by its own bureaucratic practices in order to validate the belated claim to national membership made by transborder Koreans. This analysis will also show how individuals challenge the state's classification schemes by mobilizing alternative genres of identification other than documentary traces, or by mimicking the state's documentation practices and creating their own file selves in Irving Goffman's term. And I draw on archival and ethnographic data collected during 22 months of multi-sided field research in South Korea, Japan, and Northeast China between 2005 and 2009. So let me just begin with the first case. The transition from the empire to the nation state in post-war Japan entailed the radical exclusion of former colonial subjects from the newly constituted citizenry of Japan. The Japanese government stripped remaining Koreans of citizenship collectively, and this created a political vacuum for the vehement competition between newly created, mutually antagonistic two post-colonial states. North and South Korea, interestingly, employed divergent transborder nation-building strategies to produce their own docile citizens out of Koreans in Japan, who are deeply ambivalent toward the two inchoate homeland states. So I'll present North Korea's strategy only briefly for a comparative purpose. North Korea's strategy was to represent itself as a safe haven in which Koreans could find an escape from the hostility and discrimination experienced in the former metropole Japan. The repatriation campaign, on the one hand, the photos are here, and the hefty investment in Korean enclaves, especially in Korean schools, they sent a lot of money and supported in all kinds of ways, exemplified this strategy. Thanks to the successes on both fronts, perhaps surprisingly to the contemporary observer, North Korea garnered much stronger support than South Korea for decades. The pro-North Korea organization Chongsyon acted so successfully on behalf of this absentee socialist fatherland at the neighborhood level that it was able to make this distant and nascent homeland state forcibly present and indispensable in the everyday experience of Koreans. This is well captured by the photo of this great leader hung right in Jin Tae's living room. South Korea's strategy, however, was markedly different. First, it fashioned itself as a broker that could facilitate the integration of the Korean minority into the Japanese mainstream. So not a safe haven from Japan, but more a broker that would facilitate the integration into the Japanese mainstream. The 1965 Japan-South Korea Treaty is a case in point. South Korea urged Japan to grant permanent resident status to Koreans in Japan and mitigate institutionalized discrimination against them. But Koreans were able to benefit from this arrangement only if they formally registered as overseas South Korean citizens. And they could do so by obtaining South Korean passports or national job abroad certificate, 재외국민 등록증, or by changing their nationality in the foreigners registry to Gangkoku, South Korea. My book explores how this competition over official registration unfolded at the neighborhood level more than 20 years after their homeland was divided. For example, these photos show the street of the Korean ethnic enclave in Ikaino, Osaka, right before 1971 application deadline for permanent resident status made available as a result of the Japan-South Korea bilateral treaty. The pro-South Korea organization Mindan's placard on the left here reads, "Don't let the lies fool you. Don't regret after the deadline, and apply for permanent residency as quickly as possible." Chongsyon engaged in a fierce counter-campaign, and its placard on the right photo reads, "The application for that, let's cancel the application for permanent residency and change the puppet nationality Hanguk, Gangkoku, meaning South Korea, into Joseon." So let me just add a few words about this phrase, the application for that. So basically, the argument here was as soon as Koreans in Japan identified themselves as South Korean citizens, the predatory regime in the South would send them to Vietnam as a bullet bait of American imperialism, right? So because if you register as South Korean citizens under the South Korean universal conscription system, you're going to be conscripted and then would be sent to Vietnam as a bullet bait of American imperialism. That was basically sort of the center of this propaganda, and that's why they sort of call it like application for that. So 청년지 counter campaign was actually very powerful and persuasive for many reasons at the time, but it eventually could not really prevent the massive southbound movement of Koreans on paper, if not on the map, because they were not quite like moving to South Korea, but they were changing their registration. The lure of the stable resident status was understandably very strong. But what contributed to South Korea's ascendancy in this competition in the mid-1960s was not simply Koreans' desire to take root in Japan through permanent resident status. The desire to reconnect with their home communities was as important. This leads to the second strategy of South Korea, assuming the role of a gatekeeper. The South Korean state allowed only its loyal affiliates to engage in a variety of transactions with families and home communities in the southern part of the Korean peninsula, such as sending remittances, paying visits, inviting families to Japan, or making investment. By contrast, those who did not change their registration to South Korea, like Jin-tae, could hardly maintain basic contact with their families in South Korea. The family members in South Korea also faced constant surveillance by local police, discrimination in career choices, and ostracism from local communities. Some even suffered first espionage prosecution. I'd like to note that the family registration document, as well as the passport, became an important means of converting pro-North Koreans. The family registry, called Hojok, had long served as the most authoritative identification document in Korea ever since it was first instituted by the Japanese colonial state. This document remained essential for various bureaucratic transactions, both in Japan and Korea. Lacking this document had various practical consequences for those who refused to identify as South Korean citizens. For example, a brochure published by a Chongnan-run legal counseling organization described on this individual who could not prevent his uncle in South Korea from selling off his deceased father's land. He could not override his uncle's claim to this property because he did not have a family registration showing his own relation to his deceased father. So on paper, just basically he was not the son of this father, so he could not really override the property claim of his uncle. Well, either as a broker or as a gatekeeper, the control of the bureaucratic persona was critical for South Korea's transborder nation building strategy. That is, their strategy to identify and at the same time produce new South Korean overseas citizens out of colonial era ethnic Korean migrants stranded in the former metropole. Instead of shaping the soul of the people through schools, which is the classic nationalist strategy adopted by North Korea, who also did a pretty good job in doing that, South Korea targeted their paper identity. The seemingly formalistic and minimalistic strategy, because they are just focusing on the paper identity, enabled South Korea, which was initially an underdog in this competition, to press conversion and prevent defection very effectively. By contrast, North Korea's eventual defeat is related to the fact that it could not provide self-identifying overseas North Korean citizens like Jin-tae with a reliable or desirable official identity due to lack of international recognition and its increasing pariah status. Let me just remind you of Jin-tae's comment that the South Korean passport enabled his children to travel overseas more comfortably. Those who do not obtain either Japanese or South Korean citizenship are subject to stringent visa regulations, prolonged interrogation by immigration officers, and restrictions on their opportunities to expand business overseas or to study abroad. These are the kind of disadvantages experienced as a critical liability in the highly mobile yet increasingly paranoid post-Cold War and post-9/11 world. And of course, I must add, even more so in the era of Donald Trump, North Korea is now on the list. I would be happy to elaborate more on this point later, but for now, I would just like to move on to the second case, which concerns the post-Cold War period. So the post-war and Cold War trajectories of Koreans who remained in Manchuria was starkly different from that of Koreans in Japan. Unlike Japan, the Chinese Communist Party collectively granted Koreans Chinese citizenship without conditions, and also the official ethnic minority status. And there was almost no contact between the Korean Chinese and South Korea during the Cold War period. But the situation began to change in the late 1980s with remarkable economic development in South Korea and the rapid incorporation of post-Mao China into the global capitalist economy. The influx of Korean Chinese migrants into the discovered affluent homeland as labor migrants became the focus of TMP throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. Instead of widely opening itself to co-ethnic return migrants like Germany, Israel, Italy, Spain, or many other countries actually have done, the post-Cold War South Korean state built multiple gates to control this influx. In this sense, post-Cold War South Korea was a reluctant homeland state at best. Korean Chinese fought this exclusion on multiple levels. On the one hand, they claimed that South Korea must treat them differently from other foreign migrants from Southeast Asia or even China, like Han Chinese from China, representing themselves as an essential part of the Korean nation. So they are co-ethnic returnees rather than foreign migrants, regardless of their citizenship status. And in the book, I analyzed these struggles in the legal and political spheres in depth. But for today's presentation, I want to focus on another type of struggle, the micropolitical struggles in bureaucratic settings. This struggle centered on establishing the authenticity of claimed family relations. Why was it the case? Well, as in many other states, the South Korean state gives various immigration preferences to those who are the family members of South Korean citizens. As Youngil's story illustrates, many Korean Chinese were related to South Korean citizens at several removes, perhaps. And they were also preferred initially as marriage partners in the emerging international marriage market in South Korea. Therefore, many Korean Chinese tried to circumvent the restrictive immigration policies of South Korea by taking advantage of this family-based immigration preference. And this led to the contestation over the authenticity of the claimed kinship or marriage relations, and these battles were fought in various bureaucratic settings rather than political and courtroom, etc., such as border inspections, immigration offices, and consular offices. So let me just begin with the struggle over kinship ties. To establish the authenticity of kinship ties, the South Korean state at first relied exclusively on official documentation. Applicants were required to submit the Colonial Family Registry document, as well as various official documents issued by the Chinese government. But most of these documents were difficult and often impossible to obtain even for legitimate applicants. In principle, the Colonial Family Registry was supposed to document all Koreans, including Korean migrants, to Manchuria. But the colonial state lacked the infrastructural capacity to register them exhaustively and correctly. Many records, therefore, were missing or incorrect. Migrants also had difficulty obtaining Chinese official documents. Issuing related documents was up to the discretion of local Chinese bureaucrats. Getting the right kind of document required forming the right kind of relationship, and only a few could mobilize so-called guanxi for this purpose. As a result, many Korean Chinese turned to the black market to purchase required documents. Well-prepared fraudulent documents were often accepted without difficulty, whereas genuine claimants were denied entry visas, work permits, or citizenship because of their inability to provide proper documentation. Fraud will work, truth won't became the mantra in Korean Chinese communities. Protests by Korean Chinese migrants and their involvement in quote-unquote fraudulent behavior undermined the legitimacy and the efficiency of relying exclusively on official documentation. In response, the South Korean state began to introduce other types of evidence, and these included more unofficial documents like family genealogy books, letters exchanged with South Korean kin, so that's sort of evidence of the really existing relationship, all the photos taken with his kin, and their endorsement letters. Applicants were also required to appear for interviews, and in these interviews, immigration officers test their knowledge about alleged kin and looked for affinities in appearance between alleged parents and children. But as a wider range of evidence was accepted, applications for entry visas, work permits, and citizenship skyrocketed. One consular officer in Shenyang, China, had to review 800 visa applications a day, and the backlog of naturalization cases reached 80,000 in 2007. Some Korean Chinese found the revised verification regime to be just as arbitrary and prolonged as the original one. In this context, the DNA test came to have a particular appeal to both immigration bureaucrats and Korean Chinese migrants. To immigration bureaucrats, it was an effective remedy for fraud and a convenient tool to speed up the review process. But somewhat surprisingly, the DNA test was also an attractive alternative to some Korean Chinese migrants. Despite its high cost, the DNA test drastically reduced the waiting time from a few years to a few months. Moreover, and quite unexpectedly, this particular genre of identification was interpreted to embody the Korean Chinese natural and authentic entitlement to membership in the affluent homeland, whether it was supported by quote-unquote artificial documents. So it was more like, I don't have artificial documents, but it is almost like in my blood. Contrasting Korean Chinese primordial entitlement with the quote-unquote artificial legalism of the reluctant homeland state was one of the common discursive strategies that Korean Chinese and their allies frequently engaged. An editorial in one of the Korean Chinese newspapers, for example, compared the Korean Chinese who violated immigration laws to a daughter who was despised for having married a poor guy and had to sneak into her natal home. So the sign that this protester is holding here also sort of expresses a similar idea that, because we got married to a poor guy, we are not quite welcome in our family. So they are sort of like using this analogy of being a sort of daughter who married a poor guy, which means China in this case. I will now turn to the struggle over a second type of family relation, namely marriage between a Korean Chinese migrant and South Korean citizen. As fraudulent marriage scandals caught public attention, the South Korean government began to crack down on the practice. In this case, a marriage certificate by itself, the document, could not really establish the authenticity of the marriage relation because it was a paper marriage. The paper itself was perfect. What mattered was the congruence between this certificate and the reality that it was supposed to represent. But how does one know whether a marriage is genuine or fake? All that bureaucrats could do was to make a commonsensical judgment of the plausibility of the claim to be genuinely married. The verification procedure reflected this underlying logic. During the naturalization interview, the spouses were interviewed separately about their courtship, marriage, and subsequent married life. Evidence of money changing hands or the involvement of a commercial marriage broker increased suspicion. On the other hand, the observance of all kinds of ceremonial formalities and the acceptance by their family in-laws decreased suspicion. And the interview questions ranged from the husband's drinking or smoking habits, yesterday's dinner menu, or the first presents they have exchanged. Do you remember something like that? I absolutely have no idea what I exchanged with my husband. To their income, insurance policies, debts, or their sexual life. Immigration officers might even pay an unannounced visit to the couple's home or inquire around among neighbors. Well, no matter how exhaustive and meticulous this checklist might seem, it could only measure the couple's performance after the marriage, not their intention at the time of marriage. But given the entangled and fluid characteristics of these marriages, it was extremely challenging for these couples to live up to the conventional conception of a marriage. Between the ideal type of bona fide marriage and the ideal type of fraudulent marriage lay a continuum of unions based on different combinations of affective attachment and instrumental reasoning, perhaps like every other marriage. To make matters more complicated, some citizens' spouses used accusations of sham marriage as a form of leverage to control their migrant spouse or to punish their disobedience. Korean Chinese migrants challenged the government's verification regime in various ways. Some questioned the validity of the evaluation criteria. For example, they argued that remunerating matchmakers was not evidence of a criminal conspiracy, but a normative cultural practice in China. Others took their critics further. They denounced that the bureaucratic and legal apparatuses that Korean immigration officers use as discriminatory, questioning why only international marriages are subject to scrutiny by moral gatekeepers. An episode relayed to me by an immigration officer provides a good example. He rejected one marriage migrant's application for naturalization because he concluded that the marriage might be a fake after finding out about the extramarital affair that she was having by examining her cell phone record, which is a pretty standard practice. Outraged, she yelled to the officer and said, all of my South Korean co-workers have affairs, and you now tell me we Korean Chinese can't? It has nothing to do with the authenticity of my marriage, and it's none of your business. Which is kind of right. But the majority of Korean Chinese found themselves lacking the knowledge and skills to navigate very complicated bureaucratic practices, procedures. Moreover, many migrants staked their reputation not so much on how they were labeled in South Korea, but how they were seen by the family and the community in their country of origin, which is pretty common in immigrant community. So I now turn to the perspective of the sending community. So if you think about it, right, sham marriage by definition creates an incongruity between reality and so-called paper reality. And in South Korea, this incongruity was seen as undesirable. But in Northeast China, this was really not the case. The rapid transition to market economy combined with a migration boom put gender relations in Korean Chinese communities under tremendous strain. This was manifested by a high divorce rate, but the high divorce rate was not simply a negative outcome of the migration boom. Families with limited resources went through a fake divorce before trying a fake marriage. For this reason, sham marriage provoked greater anxiety than any other migration scheme. It was accused of breaking up of real families and undermining the stability and moral order of the ethnic community as a whole. So from the sending community's point of view, it was important for the sham marriage to remain a sham, for the fake divorce to remain a fake divorce, for the paper reality to remain a paper reality. From this perspective, the ideal scenario looked like this. The migrant acquired South Korean citizenship through a sham marriage, divorces her fake South Korean husband, and then uses her newly acquired citizenship status to better support or to reunite with her real family. And this saga, of course, by shrinking the meaning of a citizenship to a passport, embodied the worst nightmare of the immigration bureaucracy. But from the migrant's point of view, it exemplified their vibrant agency, ultimate sacrifice, and their persistent devotion to their family left in China. The problem was that the successes like these were rare. In Northeast China, the most frequently heard comment on sham marriage was it is really easy for a fake divorce to become a real one. So it shows a certain kind of anxiety. The remaining spouse, generally the husband, often felt disconcerted and alienated by unwelcome changes in his wife. Her manners, tastes, accents, and ways of thinking all seemed to be Koreanized. Some husbands were disappointed to learn that their wives were so used to their lives in Korea that they didn't want to come back. In one of my informant's words, once you drink the water of South Korea, you can't live in China. The sporadic phone calls or a delay in sending monthly remittances could trigger suspicion of a betrayal. The migrant spouse, for her part, could get just as irritated by her husband's inert habits, his incompetence, or his parochialism from her now broadened horizon. And many became upset by the ways that their remittances were wasted on foolhardy investment, drinking, or gambling. So overall, my multi-sided ethnography shows that the intricate moral parameters within which these migrants and also their families sought to establish their trust, maintain respectability, and also resolve disputes within the family remained profoundly dissonant with the basic premise of bureaucratic justice and the vision of morality upheld in South Korea. So let me just recap the main findings from my empirical analysis and discuss some broader theoretical implications of this study. So during the Cold War period, if I remind you, the creation of various bureaucratic techniques like passports, national job abroad registration, family registration, and so forth and so on, enabled the South Korean state to identify these opaque populations beyond their border and define their state membership according to its own preferences. It was often against the preference of these transborder Koreans themselves or against the rival claims of other states like North Korea. These bureaucratic techniques also enabled the South Korean state to distinguish docile Koreans from the subversive and mobilize the former for its own developmental and ideological agendas. Moreover, these practices provided transborder Koreans with an indispensable and in some cases desirable bureaucratic persona, and this encouraged an increasing number of co-ethnics to align their own self-understanding, how they see themselves, with a newly created state-imposed category, in this case, overseas South Korean citizens. Weak or fragmentary documentation, on the other hand, posed serious challenges not only to the state's capacity to embrace its transborder population, but also to the transborder claims making of those imperfectly documented. The ordeal of the Korean Chinese in the post-Cold War period offer a good example. These discussions highlight how bureaucratic practices provide a crucial institutional scaffolding for the transborder membership politics. They transform newly emerged borders and unfamiliar state categories into the experiential reality of ordinary people. Furthermore, my analysis has paid sustained attention to the struggles over transborder population on the micro-political level. I have highlighted, for example, how transborder populations have mobilized a variety of counter strategies, shaping the contours of TMP in unexpected ways. Transborder Koreans often effectively resisted their forcible incorporation into the state of origin. Like Jinte and other Koreans in Japan, who remained unregistered in South Korea for such a long time, they sabotaged the state's demand for prompt and accurate documentation of their identities and affiliation, seeking to keep the predatory and violent homeland state at a safe distance, just to remain invisible and illegible to the state by not registering. On other occasions, transborder Koreans mobilize a variety of counter strategies to circumvent or challenge the gatekeeping practices of their putative homeland state. They did so through all kinds of micropolitical struggles. Ironically, it was the state's reliance on official documentation, the reliance on the paper reality created and authorized by the state itself that made official documents vulnerable to false reporting, fabrication, and impersonation. Some migrants manufactured their own paper reality and usurped the aura of irrefutability carried by official documents. And other migrants mobilized alternative genres of identification, like DNA test results or acting like married. These dynamic interactions show that the politics of immigration, citizenship, and transborder membership should be situated and studied both from above and from below, and both on the macro political and micro political levels. So to sum up, my book demonstrates that being a homeland state or being a member of the transborder nation is really not a self-evident and ethno-demographic fact. It is rather a precarious, arduous, and revocable political achievement. In particular, I have shown how the seemingly mundane bureaucratic practices mediate this contested embrace between the homeland state and its transborder populations, the making, unmaking, and remaking of transborder ties. Well, thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for your wonderful presentation. I think we'll have time for some questions, Q&A, and maybe I'll just start things off with a question about the overseas citizenship. And what was interesting to me is it's sort of like the degree of citizenship, and especially the idea of fully embracing citizenship, especially related to voting rights. And if I know that's possibly no discussion now in Korea, where there's political reasons for giving certain overseas Koreans voting rights. So I was wondering if in your research you have any, if you could expand on whether that was of any importance to, I know especially in the Japanese case, that became much more very relevant, but talk about whether these overseas Koreans can vote abroad or vote in elections.
Right. So now, actually, they can vote if they have South Korean citizenship. Not so much if they gave up South Korean citizenship, obviously. But it is actually a pretty recent phenomenon, and actually the push came from Korean Americans rather than Korean Japanese, although they were sort of part of the lobbying effort. What happened in the 1970s was actually the Park government, the Park administration, the dictator who was president for a long time, who was also the father of the recently impeached president, his administration resisted strongly the kind of lobbying effort from the Korean Japanese community for voting rights because, again, like one, there were a lot more supporters of North Korea, so they were certainly concerned about people who are more supportive of North Korea, or maybe not necessarily supportive of North Korea, but they were certainly critical of the dictatorship in South Korea. More sort of a pro-democracy movement was going on abroad because it was safer over there, and they didn't certainly want to add people who would vote for the opposition party into the pool of people who actually had the voting rights. So the Korean sort of dictatorship resisted a lot, and it only sort of became an issue, and it sort of became, the lobbying effort became successful, not just because of sort of internal reasons, but it is a kind of sort of global trend, the extending voting right to overseas citizens for all kinds of reasons, mostly for perhaps the state also has instrumental reasons to do so. So they might want to sort of keep their loyalty so that they can keep sending money back to developing countries. In some cases, for instance, Hungary, they made it possible for ethnic Hungarians living in neighboring countries to obtain citizenship pretty easily, and also right after that they can actually participate in election without ever having resided in Hungary, for instance, and that was actually led by the right-wing party, which was sort of more like a nationalistic, and they kind of thought that adding them to the sort of voting pool would work for their own political advantage, which was also the case. Which was also the case why the voting right was extended to sort of overseas Italians, etc. So it's a kind of sort of global trend in many different reasons. In South Korea, it became a little bit complicated, and also became a reality relatively late because of the universal conscription system. So that sort of makes things a little bit complicated. Yeah.
questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, my name is Takeshi Harano from Center for Japanese Studies. So thank you for a very interesting story about its Korean migration policy and integration policy about the Korean overseas. So I guess actually, so you mostly focused upon a kind of more kind of individual struggles and individual Korean overseas and their micro-politics against vis-a-vis more kind of state's bureaucratic system. And so I'm just curious, how is it between those individuals and the state, like the ethnic Korean overseas institutions like Mindan or Solen functioned to mediate or to connect or disconnect between Korean overseas individuals and state governments?
Yeah, so like actually in the chapter about Zionist Koreans, this sort of like intermediary ethnic organization is actually really central. In their case, it was even more important because Japan and South Korea did not really have a formal diplomatic relationship for 20 years, right? So Japan was defeated in 1945. The first bilateral treaty came in 1965. So for 20 years, there was no consular office. There was like legally they were stateless, like ethnic Koreans were stateless, and so who are gonna take care of them, right? And also the South Korean government was very like many other post-colonial states were very incompetent and couldn't really run that kind of a bureaucracy. So Mindan actually played a very important role, almost like as a quasi-state. So for instance, the passport and registration, that all happened through Mindan. And it later became problematic because they started to charge too much. So like for passport, for instance, like it was much more expensive than like, you know, if you compare that like even US passport or Taiwanese. And so they almost like became a kind of rent seeker in social scientific term. So, and also in case of Cheongyeon Soren, even more importantly because still there is no formal diplomatic relationship between North Korea and Japan. So Cheongyeon almost was a sort of like served as a something like consular office. So for instance, when the repatriation campaign happened in the 1950s and 60s, so North Korea really sort of pushed for the repatriation of Chinese Koreans living in Japan. It was called repatriation, but actually 90% of them came from the southern peninsula, so they didn't necessarily have the relationship with the northern part of the Korean peninsula, but this was the idea that their real fatherland is North Korea, so they should sort of come back, and because they were not really welcome in Japan. Even in that case, it was not any former state organization that played the role on the North Korean side. It was actually Soren. So the role of these like intermediary organizations were certainly very, very important. And when I said like North Korea did something, South Korea did something, it in many cases it actually happened through this intermediary organization. But it of course does not mean that Mindan did not really have any tension with the South Korean government, and Mindan actually could push for its own agendas because South Korea and North Korea were in competition. So they could sort of say, if you don't do this, then these people are going to go to North Korea. So one thing that they got was actually the exemption from conscription. So as I said, the conscription, the universal conscription was like such an important issue in this campaign, and there was a lot of sort of propaganda about do not register because you are going to be sent to Vietnam. Basically what they got was like, and actually initially the South Korean government actually wanted to recruit Chinese Koreans into South Korean citizens because after the Korean War, they really wanted to recruit as many soldiers as possible. But because of this competition, they could lobby that they could actually put in writing that Koreans who became permanent resident in Japan through this bilateral treaty are exempted from universal conscription system in Korea. So they would become South Korean citizens, but wouldn't be subjected to the military conscription system in Korea. So there were interesting, complicated interactions like that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Questions? I just have one other question there.
You mentioned interviewing informants as part of your research. I was wondering, how did you select informants or a pool of informants to represent different populations?
So this is an ethnographic research, so I wouldn't necessarily aim for the kind of a statistical representative sample, certainly. My interview process was more guided by the question that I was asking, and there was a reason why I chose ethnic Koreans in Japan and China rather than, for instance, Koreans in the United States or other parts of the world, because their relationship with North or South Korea was more complicated and ambiguous, because they left the Korean peninsula when there was neither North Korea nor South Korea. So it's not like their legal identity was already clear and then they gave up South Korean citizenship and got something else, something like that. That had to sort of create it. So what I wanted to focus on was how this sort of ambiguity and the production of citizens and the transborder nation take place with the people whose relationship to both North and South Korea is more ambiguous and complicated. So for that matter, for instance, in Japan, I certainly, for my interview and ethnographic research, focused more on people who used to or currently more identify themselves with a pro-North Korea organization, because their legal relationship and political relationship with South Korea is more complicated. So that they were sort of my focus, and for ethnographic research, you sort of do the participant observation, you go somewhere, start recruiting people, and just depending on the kind of small follow-up question that you have, and you sort of find people who can actually answer the question. And for Korean Chinese, it just depends on what chapter I am talking about, but for the chapter that I introduced today, I was sort of focusing on migrants, ethnic Korean return migrants from China, who sort of had to go through all these sort of processes for complicated reasons and faced some bureaucratic hurdles on the way. So that was sort of my criteria, and then sort of started approaching people it is usually from all kinds of ethnic organizations, certainly their community organizations. I also had another entry from the government side, so I could recruit people through by observing, for instance, this naturalization interview and finding people who are taking the exam there, and sort of trying to follow them and talk to them and getting rapport and something like that. Yeah.
So your book basically was based on what happened in the 20th century. So now,
including up to 2009.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there are lots of Korean Chinese in Korea. So they kind of build up their own strong community, and they also develop strong supporting network.
Yeah.
So what kind of significant difference do you observe from your book? Between 20th century and now, what's the difference you observe?
Do you mean
in terms of membership dynamics and?
I mean, because my book actually covered from the colonial period, so it is almost late 19th century up to early 21st century, but I couldn't put it on the title, so it sort of became long 20th century. But so I mean, if you ask me about for instance Korean Chinese changing relationship to North Korea and South Korea starting in the 1940s, I can tell you that although I didn't really introduce the chapter 3, which actually focuses on the membership politics in Cold War Northeast China. So no relationship with South Korea, but what happened between them and North Korea and China is actually really interesting, although I didn't say anything about that. So there's that, and then Korean Chinese changing relationship with South Korea. But if your question is more focused on, for instance, okay, so the migration history of Korean Chinese to South Korea has been already about 2 decades or 3 decades. If we sort of count it from the late 1980s, it would be 25 years or something, right? So if you ask if your question is about that, I can certainly say a little more about. I mean, the state policies became more tolerant and generous toward Korean Chinese, in part because of all these struggles happened. So more the kind of struggle that you would see like on the street, picketing and hunger strike and lobbying and the public hearing, etc. That certainly matter. But I also focused on what scholars wouldn't necessarily call or see as a kind of a political struggles, right? Just not violating immigration law and maybe showing some very defiant attitude to immigration bureaucrats and doing all kinds of different things, right? I sort of call it like more sort of micro political struggles in the Foucauldian sense. And because of all of these, almost the government kind of realized that it is actually not really quite like politically not tenable, and also economically unwise, because the South Korean economy may not really quite work without these people actually doing all the work like on the secondary labor market. So they certainly loosened the immigration policies toward the Korean Chinese. So nowadays it's much easier for them to sort of go back and forth between China and South Korea. And once it became possible, the marriage rate dropped, because like they just did it because there was really no way to go to South Korea. And but they still remain like the sort of social acceptance of Korean Chinese as a part of the South Korean civil community hasn't happened yet. They certainly are still like suffering many stereotypes and stigmatization. They are sometimes portrayed as more like crime prone. So the kind of thing that we would project to illegal immigrants are projected to Korean Chinese, and they would perhaps be seen as Chinese, and because of that, they also certainly, even though they benefit a lot perhaps economically by migrating to South Korea, and their actual livelihood rely a lot on their labor migration to South Korea, they may not really feel like they are accepted in the same sense, and so they certainly keep distance and develop sometimes a hostility toward the South Koreans. So that overcoming that was certainly a little difficult for me when I did my ethnographic research, because they see me primarily as South Koreans.
So prior to, you said the 1980s, when it became a little easier for Korean Chinese to immigrate to South Korea, I guess I wonder, with Korea being, well, South Korea and North Korea, with them being an ethno-nationalist country and being very focused on your ethnic identity and your blood and everything, did they already consider the fact that these people immigrated to China as some kind of stigma that they were giving up their Koreanness? Or, I mean, why did they have such strict bureaucratic sanctions on those who are still considered ethnically Korean?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So actually in the conclusion, I speculated a little bit about this idea of like a Korean, like a strong ethnic nationalism, because many immigration scholars, like comparative immigration and citizenship scholars, use this lens like ethnic nationalism when they analyze the Korean case. So when they discuss, for instance, how other immigrants, like migrant workers from Southeast Asia or marriage migrants from Southeast Asia, how they are treated in Korea. The sort of like meta lens is ethnic nationalism. But I actually really don't think it's a right way to see it if we actually sort of like look at very complicated history of the relationship between South Korea and its diaspora community. It was really never, like ethnic nationalism never trumped all kinds of different things, like geopolitical considerations and political contingency, all kinds of bureaucratic reasoning. If we focus on the case of Korean Chinese, it was actually very chaotic in the 1980s and 90s because, so like at first, there was certainly this like massive romanticism on both sides. So on the South Korean side, it was almost because like both were rediscovering each other. Korean Chinese were completely forgotten during the Cold War period, almost like forcibly, because again, like, you know, even they couldn't really, South Korea was an underdog, paranoid about the communist infiltration. They were very, very cautious against Zionist Koreans who might be supportive of North Korea. But Korean Chinese were kind of a modern minority in China. They were actually they actively participated in the Korean War on the North Korean side. So there are all kinds of history why the anti-communist South Korean government would rather want to forget about them. So it was almost a complete oblivion. And then they started to, right, like appear on the horizon, on the public sphere in the discourses. And then it sort of became like, it's almost like, oh, now we rediscovered this like a forgotten brethren. And at that point, it was pretty clear that South Korea was a winner in this like decades of competition with North Korea. So almost like this Korean Chinese aspiration to come to South Korea, visit their family, all of them were sort of considered as a source of pride. So actually at first, the South Korean government even ran some program to find the Korean Chinese brides for Korean bachelors, like in farmers who couldn't find their partners in South Korea. So like massive romanticism on both sides, Korean Chinese side too. But the encounter was, you know, pretty traumatic for many, many reasons. South Korea before that was never really a homeland for ethnic Koreans in communist countries, never claimed that, really wanted to keep them at bay or persecute them or forget about them. Suddenly these Koreans who were the citizens of the communist countries started to appear on the horizon. South Korea was never an immigration country before. It was an emigration country for a long time. But now, starting in the late 1980s and early 1990s, all the immigrants were coming from Asia. So this Korean Chinese migration to South Korea just basically put South Korea in a very awkward position that they didn't know how to deal with. So they suddenly became a homeland state. They suddenly became an immigration state, didn't know what to do with both, with Korean Chinese. Even what the homeland state position would order you to do was in complete collision with what like immigration state you would do, right? So if they see them as immigrants, you might want to control them, but like in rhetoric, they are part of the Korean nation, and so it was just completely chaotic. Yeah.
Thank you for that great, very vivid answer to that question. I just had a really quick question, and then I think we'll wrap things up. Because I was really interested in the 1965 was the deadline for the Koreans to apply for
1971.
1971.
Yeah.
What was the cutoff for the Koreans who were already in Japan during the occupation who could not become Japanese citizens?
Cutoff appointed to become Japanese?
Yeah, to become Japanese.
So it was not, there was really no like a collective process for that. It was more like, so the Japanese Empire had its own system of classifying people. So like internationally they were treated as Japanese, right? Because they were Japanese imperial subjects. But internally, the Japanese Empire had a system of like classifying, okay, so you are really Japanese, you're Korean, you're Taiwanese, etc. And if you, during the colonial period, couldn't really become Japanese, and that was only possible, for instance, if you became an adopted son of the Japanese family or through marriage, etc. But if you couldn't do it, collectively, like regardless of, let's say, I was born in Japan, I only speak Japanese, I act like Japanese, I only use my Japanese name, but still they became stateless. So that was sort of like a policy on the sort of ground. It started right after the collapse of the empire, but that sort of became a formal policy in 1952 with the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So that was a sort of part of the deal between Japan and the United States when they signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So regardless of your cultural identity, where you were born, whatever, you just became stateless. And they were sort of seen as ethnic Korean. So they had to become something because the international system didn't like having so many stateless people. But if you wanted to become Japanese, like individually, like all the others, so they didn't make any special process for ex-colonial population, which a lot of other empires did. So in other empires, for instance, like let's say I was an Indian subject of the British Empire, was living in Britain at a certain point, then they would make like them to maintain British citizenship much easier or something like that. The France-Algeria relationship, a lot more complicated, but still something like that. But Japan really didn't have it. So they had to go through the usual naturalization process, and it changed a lot nowadays. But back then, the idea was based on very much like you just had to meet really, really high bar. And that was just based on very strict idea of like cultural Japanese-ness. So like, never use like any Korean language, Korean name, Korean food, no, something like that. And because of the colonial history, many Koreans sort of took it as an insult. So many kind of resisted like obtaining Japanese citizenship. So like for that matter, sort of it was dealt more individually. Becoming South Koreans, it was also had to be done individually, but there was like that. Like, after that, they could still do it, and because South Korea and Japan sort of made it happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.